John Miller stepped through the gates of Dixon Correctional Center at 6:07 a.m. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale, indifferent light on the cracked pavement. He carried a plastic bag filled with his belongings, a worn paperback, a faded wallet with no cash, a pair of reading glasses, and a letter he had never sent. 18 years had passed since he last walked freely. The world, he assumed, had moved on without him. No one came to pick him up. The corrections officer who escorted him out gave a half-hearted nod before retreating into the concrete walls. John stood there for a moment, unsure of which direction to turn. There were no plans, no welcome home banners, no familiar faces. Just the rustle of leaves in early fall and the distant hum of a highway. He took a breath and started walking toward the bus stop at the edge of the lot. An old woman eyed him cautiously from the bench but said nothing. When the bus arrived, John climbed aboard and sat in the last row, staring out the window as miles of fields and factory ruins blurred into the skyline of Chicago. By noon, he had checked into a transitional housing facility just south of the city. The room was little more than a cot, a desk, and a barred window facing an alleyway, but it was quiet. That, for John, was enough. Later that day, during orientation with the center's coordinator, he filled out forms asking about his employment history, skills, and emergency contacts. Under family, he left the space blank. Under previous occupation, he wrote, high school English teacher. Then, with some hesitation, scratched it out and replaced it with unemployed. When the coordinator glanced at the page, she paused.
You were a teacher.
I was, John replied. What happened? I made a mistake. She didn't press further. 2 weeks passed. John kept to himself. He woke early, walked the same 3 blocks each morning, and volunteered for any chore the center needed, trash duty, kitchen help, mail sorting. He spoke little, listened much, and never raised his voice. One afternoon, while sweeping the back hallway, he overheard a conversation between a volunteer and a young woman. Have you heard about the Stories Unheard program? The volunteer asked. They collect oral histories, real stories from real people. No polish, no agenda.
Just listening.
The phrase just listening struck something deep in John. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, he retrieved the unsent letter from his bag. It was addressed to Ethan Miller, in handwriting that had stiffened over time. His son. He hadn't seen Ethan since the sentencing. The boy had been 10 years old. John unfolded the letter, reread the first 2 lines, then quietly refolded it and placed it back into the envelope. The next day, he asked the coordinator about the Stories Unheard program. She smiled. I thought you might ask. They're always looking for volunteers, listeners, not just speakers. They don't care about your past.
Just your présence. That afternoon, John met Rebecca Tran.
Rebecca had the poise of someone used to listening. A second-generation Vietnamese American, she had grown up in California but moved to Chicago to start Stories Unheard after her father passed away. He had lived a life no one had thought to document, factory worker, war survivor, amateur poet, and his silence haunted her. She greeted John warmly but didn't extend her hand. I read the note your coordinator sent, she said. You're interested in joining as a field listener? I'd like to try, John said. We send our listeners into communities that are often overlooked, nursing homes, shelters, old factory towns. We don't ask them to fix anything.
Just to be there, to bear witness.
Think you're up for that? I've been doing nothing but listening for years, he said. Rebecca studied his face. It was hard, unreadable.
A man used to holding everything in.
She nodded. Okay.
Let's start you close to home.
His first assignment was at a small community center in South Side Chicago. The area was a patchwork of struggling families, abandoned lots, and resilience. John sat in a folding chair beneath flickering lights, next to a woman named Angela. She was in her 50s, had deep lines around her mouth, and spoke with the weariness of someone who had survived too much. I lost my daughter to fentanyl 2 years ago, she said. John nodded but said nothing. She left behind a baby, my granddaughter. That little girl saved me. Gave me a reason to keep going. Still, John remained silent, just listening. You're not gonna interrupt me? She asked suddenly. No, he said. I'm here to hear you. She smiled, unexpectedly. Well, damn. That's new. After 30 minutes, she placed her hand on his and whispered, "Thank you for not looking away." That night, back in his room, John took out his notebook and wrote, "Sometimes, the most radical thing we can do is to stay present." He didn't sign it. Over the next few weeks, he visited shelters, halfway houses, and community kitchens. He listened to stories of grief, addiction, hope, loneliness, survival. He filled notebooks with fragments, not full narratives, just glimpses, a line here, a gesture there, the pause before a tear. Rebecca was impressed. "You're not just listening," she told him.
You're witnessing.
John nodded but never took credit. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about them." Then one day, while organizing files at the center, Rebecca stumbled upon a name. "Ethan Miller," she said aloud. John froze. "Do you know him?" He's my son. He's one of our media partners. Helped produce one of our early documentaries. Based in New York now." "Does he know I'm here?"
No.
"And unless you want him to, he won't." John walked away without saying anything. That night, he pulled the letter from his bag once more. His hands trembled. He stared at the envelope until dawn. But he still didn't send it. 2 weeks after John Miller began volunteering with Stories Unheard, he was sent back to Southside Chicago for another listening session. This time, it wasn't in a community center, but in the back room of a small Pentecostal church that doubled as a food pantry. The space smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. Rows of canned goods lined the shelves, and folding chairs had been arranged in a loose circle. Rebecca stood near the door, clipboard in hand, nodding at John as he entered. "We'll keep it small today," she said.
Just one participant.
She asked specifically to speak with someone, quiet. John took a seat near the edge of the circle, notebook in his lap. A few minutes later, a woman in her early 40s entered. She moved slowly, like someone who had learned to brace herself in every room she entered. "This is Valerie," Rebecca said.
Val, this is John.
Valerie didn't shake hands. Instead, she pulled out a folded photograph from her coat pocket and placed it face down on the plastic table between them. "I don't talk about this much," she began. "But I heard someone came by last week and just listened. Didn't ask questions. Didn't pity. Just sat there. That was you." John nodded. Valerie stared at him for a long time. Then, without preamble, she turned the photo over. A boy, maybe 13, smiled back at them.
This is Marcus.
"My son. He was shot 3 years ago."
Wrong place, wrong time.
Her voice didn't waver. She had already shed her tears elsewhere. "He liked books. Real books.
Not the ones on screen.
He'd read out loud while I cooked. Said he wanted to be a writer." She paused. "I used to record him, just to hear his voice later. But the phone that had all the videos, it got stolen a few months after he died." John remained still, pen poised but unmoving. "I tried grief groups. Tried talking to people. But they all looked at me like I was something to be fixed. Like I was a puzzle piece that didn't fit anymore." Her eyes searched his face. "You don't look like someone trying to fix anything." "I'm not," John said. "I'm just here to hear." Valerie reached into her coat again and pulled out a torn notebook. "He wrote stories in this. Only a few pages left now, but I read them when I can't sleep." She handed it to him. John hesitated, then accepted it carefully, like it was sacred. He flipped through pages filled with messy handwriting, little doodles in the margins, and titles like The Invisible Kid and When Trees Talk Back. "He had a big imagination," John said softly. Valerie smiled. It was the kind of smile that carried 1,000 unsaid things: pride, sorrow, longing. When the session ended, she stood to leave. At the door, she paused. "You're the first person I've talked to who didn't try to compare pain.
You just let it be."
She reached into her coat one last time and handed him a photograph. "Keep it. So someone else remembers he was here." John looked down at the boy's face. "I will," he promised.
Astérisque astérisque.
That evening, John returned to the shelter, sat at his desk, and opened a fresh page in his notebook. He didn't write Valerie's name. That wasn't the point. He simply wrote, "A mother's voice carries what no echo can reach." It holds the sound of a child lost too soon and still found in every memory. He placed the photo of Marcus beside the page and closed the notebook.
Astérisque astérisque.
A few days later, Rebecca called John into her office. The space was modest: 2 chairs, a desk, and a bulletin board filled with thank you notes and Polaroids from past participants. "I wanted to share something," she said, sliding a laptop across the desk. On the screen was a short audio clip. It was Valerie's voice. "My son didn't live long, but he was heard today. By a man who didn't talk much, but listened like he meant it." John sat quietly as the clip ended. "We're putting together a digital archive," Rebecca said. "With permission, of course. People can choose to remain anonymous or use their names. But we're calling it The First Voice. Valerie's clip will be the first entry." John looked down at his hands. "She gave me a photo of him," he said. "Asked me to remember. Do you want to include it?" He nodded slowly. "Then we will." She leaned back. "You know, John, when I started this, I thought it would be about giving people a platform. But what I'm learning is that sometimes, what they need isn't a platform, it's just a person. A presence." John didn't respond. But he stayed a while longer in the room, letting her words settle in the silence between them.
Astérisque astérisque.
That weekend, he was invited to his first team debrief at the Stories Unheard office. Volunteers from across the city gathered in a worn-down studio space, bringing coffee and homemade snacks, sharing stories from the field. One young volunteer, Malik, told a story about a teenager who rapped his entire trauma instead of speaking it. Another shared about a grandmother who refused to speak in English but communicated everything through song. When it was John's turn, he hesitated. Then quietly, he recounted Valerie's story. No embellishments.
No dramatique. Juste the truth.
When he finished, the room was silent. Then Malik said, "Damn man. That's real." Someone clapped. Then another. But John didn't smile. He didn't come here for applause. That night, walking home under the amber glow of city lights, John thought about the stories he had collected. None of them belonged to him. He didn't own them. He was just a keeper, a vessel. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't trying to erase the past, just learning how to carry it differently. He passed by a mailbox on the corner and stopped. He reached into his coat and pulled out the letter.
The one for Ethan.
He looked at it, then placed it back in his pocket. Not yet. But maybe soon. The Stories Unheard team gathered for their monthly staff meeting in a downtown office space that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old carpet. Folding chairs circled the room, laptops and notepads scattered across tables. Rebecca opened the session with updates about funding proposals and community partnerships, her tone steady but energized. John sat quietly near the back, as he always did, his notebook balanced on one knee. He wasn't used to meetings. Most of his life had been spent in classrooms or cell blocks, neither of which had prepared him for the non-profit jargon flying across the room. Words like deliverables, impact metrics, and stakeholder engagement blurred together in his ears. He understood stories, not spreadsheets. Across the circle, Caleb Johnson spoke up. Caleb was in his early 40s, with sharp glasses and sharper words. He had been with the organization since its founding and took pride in being the numbers man, the one who could translate human suffering into grant-friendly graphs. "I have a concern," Caleb said, looking directly at Rebecca. "This new volunteer, John, has been conducting sessions unsupervised. We're trusting him with vulnerable people's stories. Do we even know who he is?" The room grew tense. John didn't flinch, but he felt every eye glance his way. Rebecca answered calmly. "John came recommended by the Transitional Housing Program. I personally reviewed his application. His work so far has been thoughtful, respectful, and exactly what we need." Caleb leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "With all due respect, it's not about being respectful. It's about credibility. Donors want to know who's representing us in the field. If we send someone with, let's just say, a complicated past, it could jeopardize the entire organization." John finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "I'm not representing anyone.
I'm juste listening."
Caleb smirked.
D'était sa nice sentiment.
"But when those recordings get published, when stories go public, your name is attached whether you like it or not. And if someone digs into your past, what happens then?
Silence unheavy.
Rebecca cut in before the moment stretched too far. Caleb, I hear your concerns. But right now, the people we serve are responding to John. That matters more than what a donor might think. Caleb didn't argue further, but his expression said everything.
Astérisque astérisque. After the meeting, John lingeait by the door, waiting until the room emptied.
Rebecca approached him. You don't have to take what he said personally, she said. He's right though, John replied. My past isn't clean. If someone looks close enough, they'll find it. And then what? Rebecca studied him for a moment. Then we'll decide how to handle it together.
Renault talon indice.
John wanted to believe her. But the weight of his conviction, the trial, the sentencing, the headlines, still lived inside him like a shadow that never shrank.
Astérisque astérisque.
Meanwhile, in New York City, Ethan Miller sat at his desk in a cramped office above a non-profit newsroom. The glow of 2 monitors lit his face as he scrolled through a report sent by a partner organization in Chicago. The report included anonymized stories gathered by volunteers. One caught his eye. A mother lost her son to gun violence. She shared his notebooks with a listener who promised to remember him. There was an audio clip attached.
Ethan clicked play.
The woman's voice cracked through his headphones. You're the first person who didn't try to fix me.
You just let me talk. Ethan leaned back, frowning.
The name attached to the transcript stopped him cold.
Listenez, John Miller.
His chest tightened. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in years. He closed the report, shut down the audio, and sat in silence. For nearly 2 decades, he had lived without his father. He had told himself the man was gone, as good as dead. And now here he was, resurfacing through the same field Ethan had dedicated his career to, telling untold stories. Anger surged. How dare he insert himself into this work? How dare he pretend to be a listener, when Ethan had grown up with a father who never once listened to him?
Astérisque astérisque.
Back in Chicago, John was sent on another assignment, this time to a halfway house near Englewood. The building was decrepit, but the residents welcomed the chance to talk. He sat with a man named Terrence, who had just completed rehab after 20 years of cycling in and out of jail. I've told my story to so many caseworkers, Terrence said. But with them, it's always about progress charts.
You relapse, you lose point.
You succeed, you get a gold star. I ain't no damn report card. John nodded.
Terrence leaned forward.
You different though.
You ain't writing me down like a project. You listening like it matters.
John looked him in the eye. It does matter.
For a moment, Terrence's eyes welled with tears.
Later that night, John returned to the shelter and wrote, People don't need solutions as much as they need to be seen. To exist in someone else's awareness without judgment, that can be survival.
Astérisque astérisque.
The next morning, Rebecca received an email from a partner in New York. Subject line, Concerns about John Miller. Attached was a short note from Ethan. Do you know who this man is? He's not who you think. He doesn't belong in this work. Trust me. Rebecca stared at the email for a long time. She didn't reply right away.
Astérisque astérisque.
A week later, Ethan booked a flight to Chicago. He told himself it was for work, an upcoming collaboration with the Midwest team, but deep down, he knew why he was going. When he arrived at the Stories Unheard office, Rebecca greeted him warmly. Ethan, good to finally meet you in person, she said. He forced a smile. Likewise. Come in, we're just finishing a debrief. As he stepped inside, Ethan froze. John was sitting in the corner, notebook in hand, head slightly bowed.
For a moment, Fateren son locked eyes across the room.
The years collapsed into silence. Ethan felt his chest tighten, his throat burn.
Every emotion, rage, sorrow, betrayal, rushed back.
John looked older, smaller, quieter. But it was him. Ethan turned to Rebecca. That man, why is he here? Rebecca glanced between them. You two know each other? Ethan's voice was sharp.
D'était my fater.
The room went still. John closed his notebook slowly and whispered the only words he could find.
Hello, Ethan.
But Ethan didn't answer.
et simply walked out of the room, the slam of the door echoing through the silence. Asterisk asterisk.
That night, John sat alone in his small room at the shelter, the letter to Ethan open on his desk. He read the words he had written years ago. I'm sorry for what I took from you. I don't expect forgiveness, only the chance to listen if you ever let me. But now, even that chance seemed impossible. He closed the letter and placed it back in the envelope. His hands trembled as he whispered to himself, I'll wait. The email came late on a Tuesday night. Rebecca forwarded it to John with only a short note, We need you in Detroit.
Can you leave tomorrow?
Detroit was one of the organization's newest projects, a pilot series on post-industrial communities. Factories that had once defined the American dream were now shuttered shells, their windows smashed, their parking lots overtaken by weeds. Families who had built their lives on auto plants and steel mills were left with nothing but memories and unemployment checks. John didn't hesitate. He packed his notebook, the photo Valerie had given him, and the envelope addressed to Ethan that still remained unsent. He boarded the Greyhound bus at dawn, the city fading behind him as miles of Midwest farmland unrolled like a muted film. When the bus pulled into Detroit, the air felt heavier. Buildings stood hollowed, paint peeling in long strips. But life pulsed stubbornly through the ruins, corner stores, small churches, children weaving bicycles through cracked streets. Rebecca had arranged for John to stay in a community shelter near the old Packard plant. The shelter director, an older man named Charles, greeted him with a firm handshake.
You're the listener, ou?
Charles said. I try to be, John replied. Well, you'll have your work cut out for you.
Folk hier don't open up easy. Too many broken promises. Asterisk asterisk.
The next morning, John sat in a drafty recreation room with metal chairs and a flickering overhead light. Charles introduced him to a man named Frank Turner, 63, a former assembly line worker. Frank was tall, with broad shoulders that seemed diminished by years of disappointment. His hands, scarred and calloused, rested heavily on the table. So you just sit there and listen? Frank asked. Yes, John said.
You don't judge?
Don't try to sell me some program.
No.
Well, I'll believe that when I see it. For a long while, Frank said nothing. He stared at the wall clock ticking above them. John waited. Finally, Frank exhaled. I worked 30 years at that plant. My dad worked there before me. Thought I'd retire with dignity. Instead, they closed the doors overnight.
We lost everything.
I went from building engines to begging for odd jobs.
My wife left. Mike is barely cool.
His voice hardened. They called us family. That's what management said.
But family don't kick you out when the money dries up.
John nodded, letting the silence absorb the weight of the words. You know what it feels like, Frank said suddenly, his eyes narrowing.
You look like someone who has lost something big.
What was it? Your job? Your family? John hesitated. Both.
Factory 2.
No.
A classroom. Frank leaned back, suspicious.
Teacher, huh?
And now you're sitting here listening to whine.
You're not whining, John said. You're remembering. That matters. Frank studied him for a long time. Then, slowly, his shoulders softened. You got a family? A son, John admitted. Still talk to him? Not really. Then you know. Losing more than just a paycheck, it eats at you. Makes you wonder if you're even worth being remembered. The words struck John deeply. He thought of Ethan walking out of the office, of the unopened letter sitting in his bag. You are worth being remembered, John said quietly. For the first time, Frank's eyes glistened.
Asterisk asterisk.
Later, Charles asked John how the session went. He spoke, John said simply. That's more than most around here will do, Charles replied.
Word spread in the shelter.
A few others approached John, some cautiously, others eagerly. An older woman who had worked in the plant cafeteria, a young man who had grown up in a neighborhood ravaged by foreclosures. They each carried fragments of Detroit's collapse in their voices. John wrote everything down. Not the full stories, just the lines that carried weight. We built America, and America left us behind. I still wake up at 5 a.m. out of habit, even though there's no shift. My grandson asks what I used to do. I tell him I made cars. He says, "Where are they now?" And I got no answer. Each note was a piece of a broken mosaic, but together they painted a portrait of survival.
Astérisque astérisque.
Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Ethan debated whether to return. He hadn't answered Rebecca's calls since the confrontation. Yet part of him couldn't let it go. He pulled up the archive again and replayed the clip of Valerie speaking. He hated how genuine it sounded. Hated how his father's silence seemed to create a space that others needed. But hate wasn't the only thing he felt. Beneath it was a question he didn't want to face. What if my father really had changed?
Astérisque astérisque.
In Detroit, John continued to visit Frank each evening. Sometimes they talked about the factory, sometimes they didn't talk at all. One night, Frank brought out a dusty shoebox filled with old photos, workers lined up beside cars, family barbecues outside union halls, a faded wedding picture. "They say we're the ghost city," Frank muttered. "Maybe they're right. But ghosts deserve to be remembered too, don't they?" "They do," John said. Frank pushed the shoebox toward him. "Take one. So someone outside of here knows we existed." John hesitated, then chose a photo of Frank as a young man in coveralls, standing proudly beside a finished car.
Il kipit, John promised. Astérisque astérisque.
On his final night in Detroit, John sat alone in the shelter's chapel, notebook open on his lap. He wrote, "A city can collapse, but the people inside it still breathe. Their stories are not rubble. They are architecture, fragile, unfinished, but standing." He looked at the photo of Frank again and slipped it into the notebook, alongside Marcus's picture. He closed the book gently. 2 faces, 2 lives, entrusted to him. When the bus pulled out of Detroit the next morning, John stared out the window at the empty factories receding into the horizon. He felt the same heaviness he had carried leaving prison, the sense of stepping into a world that no longer recognized him. But now, he also carried something else, voices. And for the first time, he felt they might carry him back. John returned from Detroit weary but steadier than when he had left. The notebook in his bag felt heavier, not from the weight of paper but from the lives now etched into its pages. Valerie's Marcus, Frank's factory days, the fragments of people clinging to memory in places America had forgotten. When he walked into the story's unheard office, Rebecca was waiting. She looked at him with both relief and hesitation. "How was Detroit?" she asked. "Honest," John said simply. "And Frank? He gave me a photo. Asked me to remember him." Rebecca nodded. But then she paused, pressing her lips together as if debating whether to continue. "John," she said quietly, "Ethan's back in Chicago." John froze. "He reached out after you left. He's agreed to help us with some media coordination for the project. He hasn't said much about you, but you should be prepared. He's angry, and he has a right to be." John lowered his gaze. He always had that right.
Astérisque astérisque.
The first encounter came sooner than John expected. 2 days later, he entered the office for a debrief. The room was bustling with volunteers, laptops open, coffee cups steaming. And there, standing near the projector screen, was Ethan. He looked older, of course, 28 now, taller than John remembered, his hair cut short, his posture sharp and guarded. His resemblance to his mother was startling. Ethan didn't look up until the room quieted. When he did, his eyes landed on John with an expression that was neither shock nor warmth.
Juste recognition mixte with simmering ressentiment.
"Let's begin," Ethan said, his voice clipped. The meeting moved on. Ethan presented slides, discussed outreach strategies, mentioned potential partnerships with local radio. John sat in the corner, silent as always, but acutely aware of his son's voice filling the room. When the meeting ended, volunteers filed out. Only John and Ethan remained, separated by a long table.
You réalise sin que belongir.
Ethan asked finally. John looked at him carefully.
I don't know if I belong anywhere.
But I'm here to listen.
Ethan looked bitterly.
Listening. That's rich. Where was all that listening when I was a kid? When Mom was crying herself to sleep? When the judge asked if you had anything to say? You stayed silent then too. "I know," John said softly.
No, you don't know.
You don't know what it's like to grow up with everyone pointing at you, saying your dad's a criminal. You don't know what it's like to erase your own last name just to breathe. John's hands trembled on the notebook in front of him.
You're right.
I don't know what it was like for you. But I want to. If you'll let me. Ethan's jaw tightened. You don't get to ask that. You don't get to rewrite who you are just because you sit in rooms and let strangers cry. John lowered his gaze. I'm not trying to rewrite anything. I'm trying to carry it. Carry it? You think that makes you noble? You destroyed everything, and now you want to play the martyr. I don't want to be noble, John whispered. I just don't want to run anymore.
The silence stretched.
Ethan shook his head and grabbed his bag. You can listen to the whole damn world, John. But you'll never get to listen to me. He walked out, the door slamming behind him. John sat alone in the empty office, staring at the notebook he hadn't opened. His chest ached with the words he had never found, the ones trapped between apology and explanation.
Astérisque astérisque.
That night, John returned to the shelter and finally unfolded the letter he had carried for years. He read it aloud to the bare walls.
Ethan, I failed you. I failed your mother. I failed myself.
I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect a reply. I only hope that someday you'll let me listen, because that's the only gift I have left to give you. He folded the paper again, slipped it back into the envelope, and left it on the desk. But he didn't mail it. Not yet.
Astérisque astérisque.
The following week, Rebecca assigned John to another trip, this time to New Orleans. You don't have to go, she said gently. You've been through a lot. I'll go, John said. Sometimes distance gives people space. Rebecca studied him.
And what about you?
Does distance give you peace? John gave a faint, tired smile.
Peace is too big a word.
But maybe it gives me perspective.
Astérisque astérisque.
Meanwhile, Ethan stayed behind in Chicago. He told himself he didn't care where John went, but the truth gnawed at him. During late nights at the office, he would glance at the archive and see his father's name attached to testimonies that pulsed with authenticity. He hated it. He hated that John seemed capable of listening to strangers in ways he had never listened to his own family. But he also couldn't stop wondering, if strangers could open up to him, what did that mean? Could the man he despised have truly learned something in the silence of prison walls? Ethan refused to answer that question. He buried himself in work instead.
Astérisque astérisque.
On the bus to New Orleans, John stared out the window at endless fields giving way to the Mississippi River. He thought of Ethan's face, etched with anger but alive with truth. Ethan was right. John hadn't listened when it mattered most. He had built walls of silence, out of guilt, out of shame, out of cowardice. Now he was trying to tear those walls down, brick by brick, with strangers' stories. But the one story he needed most was the one he might never hear, his son's. He closed his eyes and whispered one day.
Astérisque astérisque.
When the bus rolled into New Orleans, the humid air wrapped around him like a damp blanket. The streets hummed with brass music and street vendors, but beneath the rhythm lay scars of a city still haunted by waterlines and loss. John stepped off the bus with his notebook in hand, unaware that this city would not only give him more voices to carry, but also force him to reveal his own. The bus rumbled into New Orleans as dawn stretched across the Mississippi. Humid air pressed against the windows, heavy with the scent of water and exhaust. John stepped onto the cracked pavement with his duffel bag and notebook, his shirt sticking to his back. Rebecca had arranged for him to meet with a local coordinator named Denise, who ran a small cultural center in the lower 9th Ward. The neighborhood still carried the visible scars of Hurricane Katrina, empty lots where houses once stood, watermarks staining the sides of shotgun homes, and murals painted on crumbling walls as both remembrance and defiance. Denise greeted him with a firm handshake. She was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, and carried herself like a woman who had survived storms both literal and figurative. "You're the quiet one, right?" she asked. "I suppose so," John replied. "Good. Around here, folks don't need speeches. They need ears."
Astérisque astérisque.
That evening, John sat in a dimly lit room at the center, where folding chairs circled a table stacked with coffee and beignets. A man named Lionel took the seat across from him. He carried a trumpet case and the weary energy of someone who had played too many gigs for too little money.
"You're the listener?"
Lionel asked. "Yes." "Well, I'm the talker tonight." He unclipped the case, but instead of pulling out the trumpet, he pulled out a faded photograph. It showed him on stage 20 years earlier, the French Quarter lit behind him, crowd swaying to the music. "I was somebody back then," Lionel said. "Played 6 nights a week. Thought the music would never stop. Then Katrina came." His voice hardened.
Water rose so high, yet tout carry my mama on my back. Lost the house, lost the club, lost half my band.
FEMA gave us a trailer and a brochure. You can't rebuild a life with that. John didn't move, only nodded gently. Lionel tapped the trumpet case.
Dix horn saved me. Kept me from drowning in the silence.
But it's different now. Crowds don't come like they used to.
My mama is gone. Sometimes me wonder if I'm just playing for ghosts.
The room fell quiet, save for the buzz of a faulty light. "Play for me," John said softly. Lionel raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "Yes."
Yele listen.
With a shrug, Lionel lifted the trumpet and played. The notes filled the room, low, mournful, carrying echoes of floodwater and memory. It wasn't polished, but it was alive. John closed his eyes. He was back in a courtroom, hearing the judge pronounce 18 years. He was back in a cell, listening to the endless buzz of fluorescent lights. He was back with Ethan, watching his son's small face harden as police led him away. When Lionel finished, John whispered, "That's not for ghosts.
That is for the living."
Lionel wiped his forehead and laughed bitterly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just don't know how to stop."
Asterisk asterisk.
Later, Denise found John sitting alone outside the center, notebook open on his knees. "You look like you've seen something," she said. "I heard something," John corrected. "Same thing sometimes."
Et hésitated.
"Can I ask you something? When Katrina hit, did you ever feel like you should have left?"
Denise shook her head.
"Everybody asked us that. Why didn't you leave?"
Why did you stay?
"But where were we supposed to go? This was home."
You don't abandon home just because the water rises. You hold on.
"Even if it drowns you."
Her word sank deep.
John stared at the dark water of the canal nearby, rippling in the moonlight. He whispered, almost to himself, "Sometimes staying is the only way to survive."
Asterisk asterisk.
That night, John couldn't sleep. He lay on the narrow cot in the shelter, staring at the ceiling fan whirring above him. The memories pressed harder here, in this city of water and survival. He remembered the accident, the classroom, the faulty heater he should have reported, the fire that spread too fast. He remembered the smoke, the screams, the students he couldn't save. And he remembered the trial, the way he had stood mute when asked to explain. He hadn't fought the sentence. He hadn't defended himself. He had stayed, because running felt like betrayal. But in staying silent, he had abandoned Ethan. John sat up, sweating despite the night air. He pulled the letter from his bag. His hands shook as he unfolded it. For the first time, he scribbled something new at the bottom. "I stayed when I should have spoken. I stayed when I should have fought. I thought silence was penance. Maybe it was just cowardice." He stared at the words, then folded the letter again.
Asterisk asterisk.
The next day, Lionel returned with his trumpet. He played outside the center, kids gathering around, clapping to the rhythm.
For a moment, the street felt alive again.
John watched quietly, notebook in hand. A little girl tugged on his sleeve. "Mister, why you just write and not play?" "I don't know how to play," John said. "Then you gotta learn." She darted off, laughing, and John found himself smiling for the first time in days. Denise approached, arms crossed. "You see? That's what survival looks like."
Musique, lauter, stubborn joy.
Even after the flood. John nodded. But inside, he wondered, could he ever find such stubborn joy with Ethan? Or had the floodwaters of his past drowned that chance forever?
Asterisk asterisk.
When it was time to leave New Orleans, Lionel pressed a small bent trumpet mute into John's hand. "Keep it," Lionel said, "so someone knows I played." John held the mute carefully, as if it might crumble.
Yelel remember.
On the bus ride back north, he placed the mute in his notebook, next to Marcus's photo and Frank's snapshot.
3 lives now carried in silence.
But in the deepest part of him, John knew it wasn't enough. The one voice he longed to hear, the one story he needed to witness, still belonged to his son. And he didn't know if Ethan would ever let him. When John returned to Chicago, the city seemed louder than before. He walked into the story's unheard office carrying his notebook, Lionel's trumpet mute tucked inside. Rebecca greeted him with a smile, but there was a strain in her voice. "John, we need to talk," she said, motioning him into her office. The blinds were half drawn, the late afternoon light slanting across her desk. She handed him a printed article. Across the top in bold letters, "Convicted teacher now collecting stories of the vulnerable. Should we trust him?"
John read in silence.
The article detailed his past, the fire in the classroom, the students injured, the trial, the 18-year sentence. It painted him as reckless at best, monstrous at worst. The tone suggested outrage that such a man was now embedded in a non-profit working with vulnerable communities. "They found you," John said quietly. Rebecca's face softened. "It was bound to happen. But the way it's framed, it's not fair." "It doesn't matter if it's fair," John replied. "It's true." Before Rebecca could answer, Caleb knocked and entered without waiting. His expression was sharp, almost satisfied. "I warned you," Caleb said. "I told you this was a liability." "Caleb," Rebecca began, but he cut her off. "Donors are already calling. They're questioning our judgment, our credibility. If we lose funding, this program dies. And it'll be because we put our faith in him." John sat still, notebook on his lap. He didn't defend himself. Caleb continued, his voice rising. "What kind of message are we sending? That someone with a record can speak for the marginalized?
D'était-ce notre rédemption, its exploitation?
Rebecca's jaw tightened. He's not speaking for anyone. He's listening. Semantics, Caleb snapped. It's still his face attached to our work. And now it's his past attached to us. The room pulsed with tension. Finally, John stood. His voice was low but firm. "He's right about one thing.
My past will always follow me.
If you need me to leave, I'll go." Rebecca looked at him sharply. "That's not your decision alone, John." But Caleb's glare made it clear where he stood.
Astérisque astérisque.
The news spread quickly.
Volunteer whispered.
Some defended John, others questioned why they hadn't been told sooner. The community itself was divided. At the shelter, Angela, the grandmother raising her granddaughter, approached him. "They're saying things about you, John. About the fire. Is it true?"
John made her eyes.
"Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. "But you listened to me when no one else did. That matters more than what's on paper." Others weren't so forgiving. A young man at the center muttered loudly, "How can we trust anything he writes down? Maybe he's just trying to clean his name." John didn't respond. He had no defense to give.
Astérisque astérisque.
Ethan, back in New York for a brief assignment, saw the article too. The headline burned through his screen. He felt two conflicting urges, satisfaction that the world now knew the truth, and anger that the revelation might somehow make his father into a martyr. The non-profit would either collapse under the weight of scandal or double down on John's redemption story. Either way, Ethan hated that the man who had abandoned him was at the center of attention again. And yet, when Rebecca called and asked if he would speak at a press forum about the controversy, he surprised himself by not refusing immediately.
Astérisque astérisque.
The forum was held in a modest community hall, with journalists, donors, and local residents crammed into rows of folding chairs. Rebecca sat at the head table, flanked by Caleb on one side and reluctantly, John on the other. Cameras clicked as questions flew. Why was Mr. Miller's past not disclosed earlier? Do you believe a man convicted of negligence should be entrusted with sensitive testimonies? Is this about rehabilitation, or is it exploitation? Rebecca answered calmly, emphasizing the integrity of the work, the authenticity of the stories collected. Caleb countered with talk of donor accountability and the risks of lost credibility. Then a reporter directed a question at John. "Do you think you deserve this role?" John hesitated. The room fell silent. Finally, he said, "Deserve has nothing to do with it. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve trust. But I can be present. I can listen. If that's not enough, then I'll step aside. But the stories I've heard, they deserve to be remembered, no matter who carries them.
Murmure rippled through the audience.
Some nodded, others frowned. And then from the back of the room, a voice spoke. He listened to me. It was Valerie. She stepped forward, clutching Marcus's notebook in her hand. He didn't try to fix me. He didn't judge me. He just listened. That's more than anyone else has done. If you take that away, you're not protecting us, you're silencing us. Her words carried weight. The room stilled again. John felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected anyone to defend him. But not everyone was convinced. Caleb leaned into the microphone. We cannot build a movement on one man's redemption arc. This is bigger than him. And then Ethan stood up. His presence startled John. I know who he is, Ethan said loudly. I know what he did. He's my father. The room gasped.
Ethan eyes locked on John, arbuste dit.
He is not a hero. Don't make him one. He destroyed lives, including mine. But I'll tell you this, for the first time in my life, I believe he's trying. Not for himself, but for the people he listens to. And if you throw that away because of what he was, you're throwing away what he's become.
Silence.
Then scattered applause. John stared at his son, unable to speak.
Astérisque astérisque.
That night, the debate raged online.
Hashtag trended, hashtag can people change versus hashtag not in my name.
Comment sections overflowed with arguments. Some insisted John's past disqualified him forever. Others argued redemption meant nothing if society never allowed it. In the midst of the storm, John sat in his small room, staring at the envelope addressed to Ethan. For the first time, he wondered if maybe he wouldn't need to send it after all. Maybe the words had already begun to reach him, not on paper but in presence. Still, he kept the letter. Some things had to be spoken directly someday. The bus wound its way through the Appalachian Mountains, climbing roads that twisted like coiled rope. Outside the window, John saw ridges stretching into mist, green slopes patched with rust-colored scars where coal mines had once cut deep into the earth. Small towns dotted the valleys, clusters of faded houses, sagging porches, and signs for churches that seemed to outnumber grocery stores. Rebecca's voice echoed in his memory. The people here are tired of being forgotten. If you can do anything, just remind them they're still seen. The town of Claiborne was little more than a main street with 2 diners, a shuttered movie theater, and a gas station that doubled as a convenience store. The community center was a converted high school gym, its basketball hoops long removed, the walls plastered with flyers for food drives and addiction recovery meetings. John sat up in a corner, notebook in hand. Only a few people wandered in that first afternoon. Most eyed him warily, the stranger with a quiet face and a Chicago accent. But by evening, an older woman with silver hair approached. My great-granddaughter said I ought to talk to you, she said, lowering herself into the folding chair across from him. Name's Mabel. You just listen, right? That's all I do, John replied. Mabel folded her hands. Then you'll hear about these hills. My husband worked the mines his whole life. Came home every night covered in coal dust, lungs black as the seams he dug from. He died 10 years ago. Doctor said it was the air that killed him, but we both knew it was the mines. She paused, her eyes sharp. Our men built this country's power. Lit its cities. And when the coal dried up, they left us to rot. No work, no doctors, no schools worth sending kids to. You think anybody outside these mountains cares? John shook his head. I think they should. Mabel's laugh was bitter. Should don't buy medicine. Should don't fix broken teeth or broken roofs. But still we hold on.
You know why?
Why?
Because des îles remembrées.
They hold our stories, even when the world don't. She leaned back, breathing heavily. You write that down.
Don't you forget it.
John did.
Astérisque astérisque.
The next day, a boy wandered into the center. 10 years old, skinny, dirt smudged across his cheeks. He watched John for a while before speaking.
You the listener?
Yes. My granny said you'd listen to her. Can you listen to my granny too? John smiled faintly.
Idée like that.
The boy ran outside, returning minutes later with a frail woman leaning on his arm. Her skin was paper-thin, her eyes cloudy but alert. "This here's Granny Ruth," the boy said proudly. "She remembers everything." Ruth lowered herself into a chair with difficulty. Her voice trembled but carried weight. "I was a girl when the war ended," she said. "My daddy came back from Europe with a limp and a heart that never healed. He worked the fields until he dropped. My mama raised 8 of us in a 2-room shack. We didn't have shoes half the time, but we had songs. That's what kept us alive. Songs in church, songs on the porch, songs to keep the night from swallowing us." She coughed, pausing to catch her breath. The boy patted her arm. "You write this down," she said firmly to John. "You write that we ain't ghosts. You write that we lived." John's pen moved slowly, his hand steady even as his throat tightened. When Ruth finished, the boy tugged at John's sleeve. "Can you tell me what you wrote? I don't want her story to disappear." John read it aloud, his voice quiet but clear. "We are not ghosts. We lived. Our songs are proof."
The boy grinned.
Ruth closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks.
Astérisque astérisque.
That night, John sat outside the center, staring at the dark outline of the mountains.
The silence was thick, broken only by the chirping of cricket.
He thought of Mabel, of Ruth, of the boy who didn't want stories to vanish. And he thought of Ethan. He pulled out the envelope again. This time, he almost tore it open to add more words, but stopped. Instead, he whispered into the night, "I want to hear your story, son. Even if it destroys me."
Astérisque astérisque.
Back in Chicago, Ethan watched the fallout continue online. The forum had ignited national debate. Some argued stories unheard had given a platform to a criminal. Others said redemption stories proved the humanity of second chances. Rebecca called him late one evening. "Your words at the forum, people are talking about them," she said. "I wasn't defending him," Ethan replied quickly. "I know. But you gave people permission to wrestle with the question, not just answer it."
Ethan exhaled sharply. "I don't know what he believe."
"He's not a hero. He never will be. No one said he was. But he might be something else. And maybe that matters."
Ethan hung up, restless.
He didn't want to admit it, but part of him felt the smallest crack in the wall he had built for nearly 20 years.
Astérisque astérisque.
On John's last day in Appalachia, Mabel returned. She placed a small worn hymnal in his hands. "This belonged to my husband," she said. "He used to sing from it when the mines felt too dark. Keep it.
So you'll remember our voices."
John held the hymnal gently, placing it beside Marcus's photo, Frank's factory picture, and Lionel's trumpet mute. His notebook now carried not just words, but artifacts, fragments of lives entrusted to him. As the bus carried him away from the hills, John looked down at the hymnal. He thought of Ethan again, wondering what token, what fragment, his son might one day entrust him with. But he knew trust couldn't be asked for. It had to be given freely, if it ever came at all. He closed his eyes, the hum of the engine blending with the memory of Ruth's trembling voice. "We are not ghosts. We lived." For the first time, John wondered if he too might someday say the same. By the time John returned from Appalachia, the organization was in crisis. Rebecca met him at the door of the Stories Unheard office with tired eyes and a stack of printouts. "It's everywhere now," she said, handing him the papers. National outlets had picked up the story. Headlines screamed, "Ex-convict fronts non-profit for the vulnerable." Talk shows debated whether it was proof of rehabilitation or an insult to survivors. On social media, voices clashed, "People don't change" versus "Give him a chance." John read in silence, his face unreadable.
Rebecca leaned against the wall.
"Donors are pulling back. Caleb's pushing for a board vote to suspend you. And Ethan, he's being asked to speak again, this time on national television."
John lowered the papers slowly.
"Then maybe I should go." Rebecca's voice sharpened. "You keep saying that, but you don't mean it. If you walk away, this whole thing becomes just another scandal. If you stay, we have a chance to show it's bigger than one man's past." John hesitated. He wasn't sure which outcome frightened him more.
Astérisque astérisque.
The next day, Caleb called an emergency meeting. Volunteers and staff crammed into the office, their faces tense. "This program is on the brink," Caleb declared. We can't afford to tie our future to a man whose name is synonymous with negligence and tragedy. I move that we remove John Miller from all fieldwork effective immediately.
Murmures rippled through the room.
Some nodded in agreement. Others frowned. Angela, the grandmother raising her granddaughter, stood up. If you push him out, you're pushing me out too. He's the only one who ever listened to me without judgment. Another volunteer chimed in. I've seen him in the field. People open up to him in ways they don't with the rest of us. That's not something you can replace with another volunteer.
Caleb's expression hardened.
We are not a rehabilitation program for felons.
We are a storytelling organisation.
And if the storyteller can't be trusted, the stories are compromised. Rebecca countered.
John doesn't tell the stories.
He carries them. That's what makes him different. That's why people respond. The room erupted into debate.
Voices rose, accusations flew.
Finally, Ethan's voice cut through the chaos. He had been silent until now, standing near the back, arms crossed. Enough, he said. This isn't about the organization anymore. It's about me and him. The room quieted. All eyes turned to him.
Asterisk. Ethan stepped forward slowly.
His gaze locked on John, steady but burning. For 20 years, I lived with his silence. I lived with his absence. You want to know if he can be trusted? I can't answer that. I don't even know if I can look at him without hating what I see. John swallowed hard but said nothing. But here's what I do know, Ethan continued. I've seen the transcripts.
I've listened to the recording.
The people he sat with, their voices ring true. They're not being exploited. They're being heard. And if we cut him out, what are we telling them? That their stories don't matter because we don't like the man who heard them. He turned to Caleb. You talk about credibility. But credibility isn't built on spotless resumes. It's built on honesty. And whether I like it or not, my father's honesty right now is the only thing keeping some of these people speaking. The room was silent. Caleb's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Rebecca looked at Ethan with quiet gratitude. Then she turned to John.
Do you want to say anything? John shook his head slowly.
Nothing I say will change what I did. The only thing I can offer is to keep listening. If that's not enough, then I'll step away.
Asterisk.
The board delayed the vote, but the damage was done. Reporters began camping outside the office. Articles dissected every detail of John's case, every court document, every testimony from the fire that had taken 2 young lives. One night, a protest formed outside the shelter where he stayed. People held signs, "Not our voice. Keep him away." Others, fewer in number, carried signs of support, "Redemption is real. Let him listen." John stayed inside, watching from the barred window of his small room.
The noise echoed up through the alley, a chorus of rage and hope colliding in the dark.
He sat at his desk, opened his notebook, and wrote. When the world screams at you, silence becomes both a weapon and a wound.
But silence alone can't carry the weight forever.
He stared at the words, then picked up the envelope again.
The letter to Ethan.
His hands trembled as he whispered, "Tomorrow. I'll give it to him tomorrow."
Asterisk.
Meanwhile, Ethan wrestled with his own storm. The network had offered him a segment to speak about the controversy. It could make his career, or break it. He rehearsed lines in his head. He's not a hero. Don't make him one. But the memory of his own words at the forum haunted him. For the first time in my life, I believe he's trying. He didn't know which version of himself he believed. Late that night, he found himself scrolling through old photographs on his computer. One showed him at 10 years old, standing beside his father in a classroom, holding a book proudly. John's hand rested on his shoulder. The boy in the picture looked trusting, unbroken. Ethan closed the file quickly, as if the memory burned. But the image lingered.
Asterisk. The collapse came 3 days later.
A donor, the organization's largest, announced they were withdrawing all funding until John was removed. Caleb seized the moment, calling for another vote. This time, the room was fractured. Half wanted to protect the mission at any cost. Half believed removing John would betray the very people they served. Rebecca turned to Ethan. You don't have to speak. But if you want to, now's the time. Ethan looked around the room, then at his father. John's eyes were lowered, his face calm but weary, as if he had already accepted exile. Ethan's voice was steady but quiet. If you remove him, I'm leaving too. Not because I forgive him. Not because I want him here. But because the work isn't about him, or me. It's about the people who trust him with their voices. And I won't betray that. Gasps rippled through the room.
Caleb's face flushed.
John finally looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat closed, his hands shook. For the first time in nearly 20 years, John allowed a single tear to fall in front of his son. The board didn't vote that night. The room was too divided. But one thing was clear, the collapse wasn't just about an organization anymore. It was about a father and a son caught between silence and voice, between past and future. And neither knew which way the scales would tip. The storm reached its peak in early winter. Snow pressed against the Chicago streets, muffling the noise of the city, but inside the story's unheard office the noise was louder than ever. Emails, calls, interviews, demands for answers. Every decision felt like a fault line threatening to split the ground beneath them. John sat quietly through it all, notebook on his lap, his artifacts tucked inside, Marcus's photo, Frank's snapshot, Lionel's trumpet mute, Mabel's hymnal. He carried them like talismans, proof that his presence had mattered, even if the world refused to believe it. Rebecca fought to keep the organization afloat. Caleb pressed harder for John's removal. And Ethan lingered in between, torn between rage and recognition. Finally, Rebecca announced a town hall. No more closed doors, she said. If this organization is about voices, then we open the floor. Let the community decide whether John should stay. The hall filled quickly, residents, volunteers, journalists, donors, skeptics, supporters. The air was thick with expectation. Rebecca opened the evening. We are not here to resolve one man's past. We are here to ask whether his present has value to this community.
Tonight, you will decide.
She gestured to John. If you're willing, share what you need to.
John rose slowly, notebook in hand.
His voice was steady, though his chest ached. I have no defense, he began. What I did, or failed to do, cannot be undone. 2 lives were lost because of my negligence. I lived with that every day in prison, and I live with it still. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect trust. He paused, lifting the notebook slightly. All I can offer is this: I listen. I carry the voices of people the world has forgotten.
Marcus, who loved books.
Frank, who built engines. Lionel, who played through grief. Mabel, who believed the hills remembered her. Ruth, who sang so she would not disappear. I carry them because they asked me to. Not because I deserve it, but because someone had to. He opened the notebook, reading one line from each story. His voice shook, but the words filled the hall like a prayer. When he finished, silence fell. Then Valerie stood, clutching Marcus's notebook. If you take him away, you take away the only person who remembered my boy without pity. I won't let that happen.
Frank's voice came from the back.
He remembered me when I thought nobody would. That's worth more than 100 donors. Others rose, Angela, Lionel, even the boy from Appalachia who had traveled with his granny's hymnal in hand. One by one they spoke, not about John's past but about the present he had created for them. Caleb, red-faced, tried to intervene. This isn't about sentiment. It's about credibility. But the voices drowned him out. And then Ethan stood. The hall hushed. He looked at John, eyes burning. He is my father. And I hated him for most of my life. I hated his silence, his absence, his cowardice. I still don't forgive him.
I don't know if he ever will.
John lowered his gaze, bracing for the blow. But, Ethan continued, I can't ignore what I see. He has done for strangers what he never did for me. He listened. And maybe that's his penance. Not prison time, not apologies, but carrying stories heavier than his own guilt. If you ask me whether he should stay, I'll tell you this: the people he listens to have already answered. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded, some shook their heads, but the tide had shifted.
Rebecca closed the meeting with calm authority.
This organization will not turn its back on the voices who trust us. And if John is part of why they trust us, then he stays. Those who cannot accept that may step away. The rest of us will keep listening.
Astérisque astérisque.
The controversy didn't vanish overnight. Donors were lost, critics remained loud. But new supporters emerged, people moved by the idea that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about carrying it honestly. Stories unheard survived.
Slowly, it grew again.
John continued his work, traveling to places where silence weighed heavy, reservations in the Dakotas, shelters in Los Angeles, storm-scarred neighborhoods in Florida. His notebook grew thicker, pages filled with fragments of lives entrusted to him. Ethan kept his distance, but he didn't walk away. Occasionally he joined a debrief, or reviewed recordings for the archive. He never softened openly, but his presence was its own answer. He hadn't closed the door completely. One evening, after a long session in a South Side church, John returned to his room at the shelter. On his desk was an envelope. His breath caught when he saw the handwriting. It was Ethan's. Inside was a single sheet of paper.
Forward, I'm not ready.
Yet. John held the note for a long time, tears blurring the letters. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was a beginning. He placed the note inside his notebook, alongside the photo, the snapshot, the mute, the hymnal. Artifacts of lives he carried, now joined by the one voice he longed for most. Months later, John was invited to speak, not as a storyteller, but as a listener. A small university wanted him to talk about silence, about what it meant to carry voices not his own. He stood before a lecture hall filled with students, holding his notebook. I am not a good man, he began.
I am a man who failed.
But failure doesn't erase the duty to listen. Listening is not passive. It is work. It is weight. It is saying, you exist, and I will not let the world forget you. He read a few lines from the notebook. Not his words, but the words of those he had carried. When he closed the book, the room remained still, reverent. A student raised her hand.
What about your own story? Who listened to you?
John paused. For the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. My son, he said softly. Not yet. But maybe one day.
Astérisque astérisque.
That night, alone in his room, John placed the notebook on his desk.
He whispered to the face inside it. Marcus, Frank, Lionel, Mabel, Ruth. You're not ghosts.
You lived. And as long as I breathe, you'll be remembered. He sat back, the silence surrounding him. But it was no longer the silence of prison, nor the silence of guilt. It was a silence filled with voices, alive in memory. For the first time in decades, John felt something close to peace. The listener had found his legacy, not in redemption, not in forgiveness, but in carrying the voices of others with a quiet, unshakable devotion. And perhaps one day, in carrying the voice of his son too.